d5, c4, c6, queen, knight, c3, queen's gambit, Slav defense, opening line. D takes c4, queen's gambit, Slav defense, opening line. e3, out of opening book. e4 would have been in the queen's gambit, Slav defense, Alekhine variation, book opening. Attacks black's pawn at c4. b5 protects black's pawn at c4. a4. b4 attacks white's knight at c3. Knight e4 moves it to safety. Queen d5 removes the threat on black's pawn at c4, attacks white's knight at e4, and blocks white's pawn at d4. Knight d2 moves it to safety. c3 attacks white's knight at d2. B takes c3, removes the threat on white's knight at d2 and attacks black's pawn at b4. B takes c3, threatens white's knight at d2 and creates a passed pawn on c3. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Knight b1 moves it to safety and attacks black's pawn at c3. Queen a5 removes the threat on black's pawn at c3 and blocks white's pawn at a4. Queen c2 blocks black's pawn at c3. e5. Knight f3. Knight a6. Slightly better is e takes d4. Knight takes e5. Threatens black's pawn at c6. White wins a pawn. Material is even. Knight b4 protects black's pawn at c6 and attacks white's queen. Queen b3 moves it to safety. Bishop e6 threatens white's queen and enables the long castle. Bishop c4 protects white's queen and enables the short castle. c2 moves it out of immediate danger, attacks white's knight at b1 and adds a promote threat at c2. Bishop takes e6. Slightly better is knight d2. Knight d3 check forks white's king and white's bishop at c1. King e2 moves it out of check, protects white's bishop at c1 and triple forks black's knight at d3, black's pawn at c6 and black's pawn at c2. Knight takes e5, removes the threat on black's pawn at c6. D takes e5. F takes e6, clears the way for a queenside castle. Queen takes e6, check, removes the threat on white's pawn at e5 and white's knight forks black's king and black's pawn at c6 and creates passed pawns on e5 and e3. Black wins a bishop and a knight for a knight and a pawn. White is ahead by a pawn. Knight e7 removes the threat on black's king and black's pawn at c6 and attacks white's knight. Knight d2 moves it out of immediate jeopardy and removes the promote threat at c2. Queen d5. Pins white's pawn at g2 and forks white's queen and white's pawn at g2. Queen takes d5. Partially pins black's pawn at c6, frees white's pawn at g2 from the pin, and protects white's pawn at g2. Knight takes d5. Frees black's pawn at c6 from the pin, and enables the long castle. Black wins a queen for a queen. White is up a pawn. Knight e4. Rook b8. Seizes the open file. Bishop d2. Bishop b4. Clears the way for a kingside castle. Rook h c1. Threatens black's pawn at c2, blocks black's pawn at c2, and removes the promote threat at c2. Bishop takes d2. Attacks white's rook at c1. Knight takes d2. Removes the threat on white's rook at c1. White wins a bishop for a bishop. White is up a pawn. Knight b4. Removes the threat on black's pawn at c2. Knight f3. King e7. Knight e1. Rook h d8. Seizes the open file. f4. c5. Advances the passed pawn. Knight takes c2. Takes the knight away from the edge of the board. White wins a pawn. White is ahead by 2 pawns in material. Knight d3. Attacks white's rook at c1. Rook c b1. Moves it out of immediate danger. Knight b2. Rook a2. Knight takes a4. Attacks white's rook at b1 and creates a passed pawn on a7. Rook takes b8. White wins a rook for a pawn. White is up a rook and a pawn in material. Knight c3 check. Moves it to safety and forks white's king and white's rook at a2. King f3. Moves it out of check and attacks black's pawn at a7. Knight takes a2. Removes the threat on black's pawn at a7. Black wins a rook. White is ahead by a pawn. Rook b5. Moves it to safety and threatens black's pawn at c5. Knight b4. Attacks white's knight. Knight takes b4. C takes b4. Pushes the passed pawn. Rook takes b4. Isolates black's pawn at a7. White wins a knight and a pawn for a knight. White is ahead by 2 pawns. Rook a8. Moves it behind the passed pawn at a7. King e4. a5. Threatens white's rook and advances the passed pawn. Rook a4. Moves it to safety and blocks black's pawn at a5. King f7. g4. King e7. f5. h6. h4. King f7. e6 check. Checks black's king and advances the passed pawn. King f6. moves it out of check and blocks white's pawn at f5. Rook d4. King e7. Blocks white's pawn at e6. Rook d7 check. Checks black's king. King f8. Moves it out of check. e7 check. Checks black's king and adds a promote threat at e7. King e8. Moves it out of check, threatens white's rook, blocks white's pawn at e7 and removes the promote threat at e7. Rook d8 check. Moves it out of harm's way and forks black's king and black's rook. Rook takes d8. Removes the threat on black's king. E takes d8. Queen check. Forks black's king and black's pawn at a5. King takes d8. Protects black's pawn at a5. Black wins a rook for a rook. White is up a pawn in material. King d5. King e7. g5. a4. Advances the passed pawn. King c4. H takes g5. Threatens white's pawn at h4 and isolates white's pawn at h4. H takes g5. White wins a pawn for a pawn. White is up a pawn. King d6. e4. Advances the passed pawn. King e5. Attacks white's pawn at e4 and blocks white's pawn at e4. King b4. Attacks black's pawn at a4. The game ends with no result.